This is a chilling tale of a train conductor who becomes stranded in a dark underwater tunnel with several passengers. The automated system's voice repeatedly echoes the same phrase, but soon something terrifying begins to unfold, affecting both the passengers and the train systems. The conductor confronts inexplicable events, gradually realizing they are not alone in the tunnel and that an unseen and ominous presence is influencing everyone there. That voice was really starting to get to the driver. "We will depart shortly. Please wait." They'd been hearing that for 20 minutes now. The train was stalled 2 miles into the transbay tube. It wouldn't budge an inch, but the driver's console showed that everything ought to be working, so it must be a problem with the tracks. She called it in, then assured her passengers everything was all right, and then waited. It wouldn't be so bad if the PA didn't seem to be on the fritz as well. Every few minutes a woman's disembodied, mechanical voice chimed. "We will depart shortly. Please wait." She couldn't turn it off. She didn't remember ever hearing that announcement before, but then, she'd never had a breakdown like this before either. The train hummed on its electric rails, sealed up inside a steel tube submerged 130 feet below the surface of the bay. Her ears were stopped up from the pressure of the water above them. Up ahead, all the driver could see was darkness, the occasional lighting fixtures doing nothing except demonstrating precisely how pitch black it really was down here. She'd made this trip 6 times a night every night for 7 years, back and forth across 30 miles of track between SFO and Bay Point, which meant back and forth through the underwater tunnel 6 times, and never before had she stopped to consider the crushing weight of all that water. She thought she could hear bolts straining and water dripping somewhere. Just her imagination, of course, but still. "We will depart shortly. Please wait." She toggled the PA switch again. It hadn't done anything the last 5 times, but she could help trying NCE more. She checked the security monitors. The passengers seemed calm enough, considering the circumstances. Her 4-car train held only 7 people as they came up on 1 o'clock in the morning. 2 were dozing and 1 was pacing the aisle. All but 1 had white earbuds snaking into the sides of their heads, and they would nod now and then to whatever they were hearing. She envied her rider's calm. If it just weren't so dark out there, she might not be so frazzled. The tunnel looked like it went on forever. And if they had stopped anywhere but under the water? And if that damn voice would just knock it off? "We will depart shortly. No one can hear me but you. Please wait." The driver blinked. What was that? She toggled the switch again, but of course, nothing happened. Up ahead, one of the lights winked out. Or was that her imagination again? She fanned herself with her clipboard. The stalled train seemed hot and stuffy all of a sudden. The air conditioning was still on, according to her diagnostic panel. Perhaps it was just the confinement wearing on her. Would dispatch ever tell her what was going on? She thumbed the call button again. Any word on that track problem? She blurted it out, not even bothering to identify herself first. The only answer was static. She frowned and hung up. She began to sweat, and she pinched the ridge of her nose, eyes squeezed shut. A headache was coming on. "We will depart shortly. Please wait," the automated voice word. Then, they're already inside. Look at the riders. The driver's eyes snapped open. What did it say? She looked up and did a double take. She grabbed a Windex-soaked rag and rubbed the monitor screens, but nothing changed. Something must be wrong with the cameras? Cars 3 and 4 looked fine, but in car 2 both of the sleeping passengers looked like indistinct, gray blurs. In car 1, the same car she occupied, in the driver's carriage up front, the pacing man looked perfectly normal, but the woman in the back seat with the earbuds in also appeared blurry and distorted, as if a film of cobweb or a tiny fog bank covered her body. The driver looked over her shoulder, peering into the car through the plastic divider. The woman was still sitting there, staring at the blank tunnel wall outside her window, nodding her head to whatever was streaming through the wires in her ears. She looked perfectly fine. The driver chuckled a little at having scared herself, then rubbed her temples. The annoying recorded voice pinged again. "We will depart shortly." "No, we won't. We won't leave until what's keeping us here lets us go. You are not watching the riders." This time the driver was sure of what she'd heard. "What the hell?" She reached for the toggle. "You can't turn me off. No one can hear me but you." A tingling sensation crept across the back of the driver's neck. Her hand froze halfway on the switch. Her fingers trembled. "Look at the riders again," the voice said. She hesitated. "Look!" When the driver looked, she squinted and then leaned in, as if being closer would somehow change what was there. 2 more of her passengers had lost definition on the video feed, leaving only 2 still showing up clear. The driver tapped the screens. "What the hell?" The sight of those blurry figures gave her chills, for some reason. Their images seemed to wriggle and writhe, as if a cloud of tiny insects were crawling over them. The 2 sleeping passengers woke and, walking in unison, moved up to the first car. She expected to be able to see them clearly once they'd moved, but the grainy blur stuck to them as they moved. She looked over her shoulder again. Both of them were in her car now. One was a teenager, short and fat, the other an old man, gray and thin. They sat side by side in the front seats, though they'd been separate before. The pacer didn't seem to pay them any mind, but he did finally sit down. The driver watched as he fitted in white earbuds. "It's spreading. They're inside. You have to get out of here," the train's voice buzzed at her. "Shut up," the driver mumbled. She looked at the monitors again. More passengers had moved up, 4 were in the second car now. They all sat rigid in their seats, and they all faced forward. None of them spoke. She called dispatch again, but this time there was not even static, just dead air. Outside, the tube lights were turning out one by one, and the train's lights were flickering too. "Help won't come in time," said the train. The PA warbled it was losing power as well. "You have to run. They're in the wires." Now everyone was crowded into the lead car. All 7 riders sat side by side in the frontmost seats, staring at her. Their unblinking eyes looked flat and painted on in the flickering fluorescent lights. She tapped on the plastic divider. "Folks," she said, working hard to stop her voice from trembling, "they'll be here to help us any moment. If you could all just head back to your original seats. We shouldn't crowd the lead car in case of an emergency." No one answered. No one moved. The man nearest her removed his earbuds and looked at her. Her CCTV monitors were failing one by one. The faithful voice of the PA buzzed in her compartment, barely audible as the train's electrical systems slowly died. "They're turning everything off," it said. "They're in the wires. They used the wires too." The 7 passengers all stood up. The driver went to open the door to her compartment, then thought better of it and locked it instead. Only the emergency lights were on now, and the passengers were dark blue silhouettes in the gray electric haze. "Folks, just return to your seats. Return to your seats," and her mouth went dry. Too late. The PA was overwhelmed by static. The static cleared for a moment. "The dead are just voices, but we can travel through the wires, into machines, even into bodies, through the wires." 7 shapes crowded around the window. The driver tried to shrink back, but there was no room in the tiny compartment. "The 8 want new bodies. I told them not to do it, but they wouldn't listen. I tried to warn you. I tried." The PA went dead. The consoles were all dark. Outside, the tunnel was a long black passage to nothing. Inside, only one light was working. The driver heard fleshy palms slapping against the divider. Someone was pulling on the door. The flimsy lock jiggled. The divider broke in half and fell in, and then hands were grabbing her, pulling her, dragging her out. They were cold hands. She was screaming now, but with 2 miles of empty tunnel on either side and 130 feet of water overhead, there was no one to hear her. They held her down. "Let me go," she said. She felt cold all over. She felt something that made her think of the icy belly of a snake slithering across her body. One of the passengers leaned in. "It's okay," he said. Cold breath tickled the driver's ear. "It's okay," the passenger repeated. "We're not going to hurt you. We just want a ride." My friend hasn't spoken in days. I wish I never found out why. I live in a pretty rural area. It takes a little over an hour to drive to the nearest town, but I'm not completely isolated. My good friend Rob and his wife, Irina, are a 10-minute walk from my house, and our friend Anton owns a farm that's a 20-minute walk down the road. I was talking with Anton at my house last night when Irina knocked on the door. She looked like she hadn't gotten much sleep in a while. "Is everything all right?" we asked her near simultaneously. "Robbie's not well, I think. He hasn't talked since he fell. I'm really worried about him," she blurted out. "Robbie fell? When?" Let me start again. 2 days ago, Robbie told me he was going hunting with Ivan, so I took a nap on the couch. Ivan, our dog, woke me up by barking at me. I also heard gunshots in the woods. I followed Ivan outside and he took me to a pit just as Robbie climbed out. He looked out of it. He was very pale, so I nearly had to drag him home, but he wouldn't tell me a thing about what happened. He just stared blankly at me. "And he hasn't talked since?" Anton asked. "No. He hasn't even eaten around me, but half of the fridge was empty this morning, and I doubt it was Ivan. Let's go see him. Maybe he'll be more talkative with some friends around." So we walked to his house and he was sitting at the table, exactly as Irina had described. Staring blankly ahead, pale as a ghost. "What's the matter, Rob? Irina says you haven't been talking much lately?" I asked carefully. "Are you giving her the silent treatment to get on her nerves?" Anton joked. "Apparently you haven't eaten in a while, now that'd be a first." Anton laughed and slapped Rob on the back when suddenly Rob leaned forward and started to retch. "Oh, crap. You all right there, Rob?" Rob hacked out a large red bug onto the kitchen table. Then a dozen smaller red bugs crawled out of his mouth and down his face before suddenly he vomited a torrent of writhing red insects across his kitchen. Anton and I started yelling and stomping any bug that got close whilst Irina stood in horrified silence. A horde of smaller bugs began amassing directly in front of me, but I grabbed the kettle and emptied its contents onto the squirming mass. By now the vomiting had stopped and Rob had fallen backwards out of the chair, his eyes rolled back in his head. The smaller bugs scuttled out of the doors and windows and all of the larger ones had been stomped into a maroon pulp. "What in the hell was that?" whispered Anton. "Only one way to find out," I responded. "I'm sorry to ask this of you, Irina, but can you lead us to the pit you found Rob climbing out of?" Once we got there, I shone a flashlight in and saw a few animal bones. After a few minutes, a sickly-looking rabbit with patches of fur missing hopped towards the pit. As soon as it fell in, more of those red bugs swarmed out of its mouth and deeper into the cave. Irina flinched at the sight of this. "Irina, go home and call someone to tell them that Rob is dead. Anton and I will deal with this." Anton and I went to his house and gathered what we needed. Gasoline. And a lot of it. Once we returned, we drenched the bottom of the pit with it and threw a match in. It lit up immediately, and it was hugely cathartic to see those bugs go up in flames after what happened to poor Rob. Anton managed to craft some kind of improvised explosive and sealed off the pit afterwards. We drove to town after that. Anton is trying to explain that Rob died in some sort of hunting accident while I dropped Irina at her sister's house in town. The poor woman, having to that happen to her husband. She must be traumatized, because she hasn't spoken since last night. A man finds his beloved dog, Loki, dead and emaciated on his lawn, an occurrence that baffles and saddens him. Seeking answers, he has his cousin, a veterinarian, perform an autopsy on the dog. In the following days, he begins to experience an insatiable hunger and rapid weight loss. I buried my dog last month, I think. There was so little left of him, and his once golden rich coat was so faded and sallow that this empty, sickly canine corpse hardly seemed to be the same cheerful, energetic good boy who had run after the neighborhood cars so quickly, who retrieved that red squishy ball so playfully, and who had served so loyally as a companion in the park when I needed to display his inherent cuteness to act as my chick magnet. Loki, I called him, simply because his pointy little ears evoked the classic helmet of the Marvel incarnation, and he always seemed to have a knowing grin fitting of the god of mischief. It was not a name selected, I must emphasize, with any idea of the hell his death would send me to, or that from his depth I would be tormented by my own personal Jormungandr. I awoke that morning with an odd, undefined sense of dread. It was the sound of silence that stirred me out of gray, troubling dreams. There was none of Loki's jubilant, early morning barking, nor his hungry scratching at my door, and the pitter-patter of his padded paws could not be heard. I sensed intuitively that something was wrong. There was a draft in the house, and I came down to find the front door open. I cursed in incredulity. I always locked up. But somehow the door was open and the dog got out. Imagine my shock when I stepped onto the front lawn, looking for my missing dog, and found that emaciated, discolored corpse waiting for me. My throat sunk into my intestines as I looked at that dead lump of sickly flesh that had once been my best friend. I turned pale in shock. My skin felt tight and cold, and my jaw gaped open. I didn't even notice I was standing, barefoot, in his last shit. I was not only shocked, but puzzled as well. The boy hadn't been sick. There was no visible injury. How had it happened? What killed him? My cousin Ivor is a veterinarian. I was saddened by my dog's death, and perturbed by the mystery of it. A rational mind might tell me there was nothing supernatural or uncannily strange about it. An undetected brain tumor, or maybe he ate something he shouldn't have. Ivor empathized and offered an autopsy to assuage my curiosity, if nothing else. Using a shovel, albeit gently, to pick up my friend and put him in a black garbage bag felt so inglorious and disrespectful. Driving to my cousin's clinic, I felt that no explanation would be sufficient, no combination of words and condolences would replace the gap in my life and the hole in my heart. The autopsy took a couple of hours. Ivor told me the results would take a few weeks and looked perturbed by what he had seen already. I didn't ask him any questions, and he handed me my best friend in a small, unmarked box. I buried him in the backyard and resigned myself to a life without Loki. People grieve differently, and, I suppose, we react differently to different kinds of deaths. When my mother killed herself, I lost all appetite, and the food I forced down my throat tasted of ashes. Yet in the days and weeks following Loki's passing, I found I was struck by a strange, insatiable hunger. I naturally assumed this was a coping mechanism, and wondered if I would return to normal, if I ever was, when I got the results of the autopsy. Closure is such an odd, human concept, and I wonder if any of us ever truly find it. Not in this life. The strange thing was, as much as I ate, I couldn't seem to fully fill my belly, and I hungered still. My friends were shocked and concerned by my weight loss. They knew about my dog and would also assume I was growing thin out of grief. I didn't puzzle their minds and perturb them by my strange, nightmarish fancy that it wasn't just my mouth that demanded sustenance. That I had 1,000 appetites within me all calling out for more, more, more. Something that could never be satisfied or even questioned. I started to eat things I never had before. I always found escargot disgusting, but now I was scarfing down plate after plate of snails, craving them in the middle of the night. Part of me even wanted to try them raw. I couldn't even taste the slimy squishiness. There was no pleasure in eating anymore. I just knew I had to have it. I actually lost weight. I spent my days inside with the curtains closed. I avoided the sun and often let the phone ring and ring until my friends left messages I deleted without listening. Sleep was slow in coming and filled with unsettling dreams I forgot by the time I fully regained consciousness. Sometimes I was awakened by nothing less than the rumbling of my own empty stomach, demanding that I go to the kitchen for a bowl of cottage cheese, week-old pizza from the freezer, that bruised apple that looked a day from spoiling. Or yes, more of those awful snails. It didn't matter. Nothing tasted like anything and nothing could fulfill me. My bowel movements were prolonged and painful. I would instantly flush because I didn't want to know if there was blood in my stool. My skin was pale and pasty. There were black rings under my eyes and I didn't recognize the face in the mirror looking back. I think I was falling apart. I didn't want to go to a doctor. Nothing they could tell me would be any comfort, and there was no cure for whatever this was. There was something new in me, but what I initially thought of as a gape in my life didn't feel accurate. It had been filled, unmistakably, with something. The thought, a question as unanswerable as the hunger, kept me up at night. Had I caught it from Loki? Was it death? Was it something worse? In this life, there are questions we don't really want answered. I got mine last night, and I don't know if I will ever sleep again. I woke in pain, a terrible pain I had never felt before and could not define. I sat up and found blood on the sheets. A dripping red stain, but no wound. To my horror, I realized it was coming out of the back of me. I gasped for air as the foulness of the situation I still didn't understand, not at all, washed over me. There was so much blood, I felt weak and drained. I don't know if I had anything left in me for tears, so I just howled for how unfair, how painful, how senseless it all was. My dry, self-pitying sobs were broken only by the ringing of my phone by my bedside. It was Ivor, of course, pretty much the only number I would answer these days. He normally wouldn't call at such a godless hour, but he knew I was suffering, just waiting for an answer. If he knew that I was not only waiting to hear the results of my dog's autopsy but afflicted with something indescribable myself, he would have spoken with more alarm and caution. If I knew what he had to tell me, I would not have picked up the phone. I know it's late, my cousin said tiredly, but I got the results. He paused with anticipation. Would you prefer I call back tomorrow and talk about it then? No. I snapped quickly, perhaps louder than I should. I took a breath and tried to calm. I'm sorry, I'd just like to know now. Please. Yeah, he responded agreeably. He had no idea what I had been going through. He hadn't seen me since the day I dropped off my dog. It turns out, Loki had parasites. Parasites? I swallowed as that ugly word rolled over my tongue and let it settle. You taken any trips to Indonesia recently? He asked with a more than intellectual curiosity. Indonesia? The question baffled and annoyed me. What was he on about? Tinea pedoha, he announced. Indonesian tapeworm. I knew it was worms, but I had to send away to find out this deadly variety. Very rare. Almost extinct in the wild. He sounded unsettled. Apparently, it's typically found only in the intestines of orangutans. Orangutans, I repeatedly dryly, rubbing the bridge of my nose. Nearly extinct. God knows how it got in your dog. So it's I caught my breath as I tried to gather my thoughts. It's bad, right? Haven't been many studies, he admitted. But it does appear to be the kind of thing that drains the host. Spreads from the intestine to parts unknown. Reproduces internally, latches onto the digestive system, growing and growing while the body eats and shrinks and weakens. They even get into the brain, adjust the behavior so that the host eats what they want. Stays until there's nothing left but a dry, empty husk. I felt a chill come over me. I could barely ask this next question, but I had to know. How? I took moment. How do they spread? You have to eat the host or what? That's one way. Or you could step in the host's feces. That's where they lay their eggs. That was it then. I had forgotten all about that detail, which at the time I thought was just a gross little annoyance of a day of tragedy. I was more concerned with laying my dog to rest than washing my feet. Now I knew that one misstep I had blocked out of my memory as soon as I was clean had damned me. I dropped the phone without thanking my cousin or saying goodbye. I was so beyond such niceties now. I didn't even care that my screen cracked on the hard wooden floor. I didn't care about any of that anymore. I wanted to withdraw from this foul world. I wanted to be alone. But I wasn't. No sooner had the phone dropped than I was struck with a sharp, searing pain in my backside. It was like I was being torn apart. My insides were on fire. I ran to the restroom even though I knew it was futile to try to drain this evil out of me. I sat there for hours, dry sobbing and hoping for some relief that wouldn't come. Then I heard it. A faint sound, coming from within myself. It started with a strange hiss, like steam escaping, then it started to talk. "He's right, you know," came an uncanny, high-pitched voice I could only describe as inhuman. "We are inside you, and we're not going anywhere. We like it in here, crawling around, eating what you eat, draining you from within, making our home here. It's not just your intestines. We're all over. We'll be in your brain soon. You won't be able to think for yourself. You'll just be a vessel. You will waste away while we grow stronger and legion." Then I felt a squiggling come out of me. I jumped up in shock and was more disgusted than I had ever been in my life when I looked in the mirror and saw the king worm, thin and slimy, poking out to taunt me. I will never forget its beady little eyes or sharp fangs as it grinned and told me, "So eat hearty," before withdrawing back into my bowels. I don't know how much time I have left. I don't care. My thoughts are getting hazy. All I do now in my last days is eat and eat, feeding those monsters inside me. It won't be long soon. When they crawl into my brain, I hope they make me okay with it. I am their slave, but maybe my horror will fade into complacency as I am eaten alive from within. They will leave me an empty shell like the last time I saw my dog, if it was even him anymore. Until then, I am in hell, where the worm does not die.